I signed everything they put in front of me, without reading a single line, and that was the moment my son finally smiled at me the way he used to when he was a little boy, except this time there was something colder behind it, something calculated that most mothers would have noticed right away. But I didn't react, I didn't question, I didn't even hesitate. I just picked up the pen, adjusted my glasses, and let the ink settle onto paper as if I were signing a birthday card instead of what they believed was the end of my control over everything I had built for the last 45 years. And across the table, my daughter-in-law Lily shifted slightly in her chair, her fingers tightening around her leather folder as she watched every movement I made, waiting for a sign of confusion, of resistance, of weakness. But I gave her none. I gave them nothing but a quiet, steady hand and a calm expression that made them think I didn't understand what was happening, and maybe that was the first mistake they made, or maybe it was the last one that truly mattered, because people like Lily always believed that silence meant surrender, that age meant decline, that a woman who had buried her husband just 6 months ago would be too tired, too lost, too dependent to fight back, and Jason, my son, my only child, sat beside her with his arm resting along the back of her chair, not even looking at me directly as I signed the final page, as if avoiding my eyes would make what he was doing feel less like betrayal and more like necessity, and I could almost hear the thoughts running through his head, the justifications he had rehearsed, the quiet little lies he told himself at night, that this was for my own good, that the house was too big for me, that managing the finances was too complicated now, that they were simply stepping in to help, to take care of me, to make things easier. But the truth sat there on the table between us in black ink and legal language, heavy and undeniable. And the man across from me, their lawyer, Charles Bennett, watched in silence as I finished signing, his eyes flicking between the documents and my face with a kind of cautious curiosity that hadn't been there when I first walked into the room, because he had expected something else too, a protest, a question, maybe even tears, but instead he got a 70-year-old woman who signed away her home, her accounts, and her authority without a single word of hesitation. And when I placed the pen back down neatly beside the folder, I folded my hands in my lap and looked at him with a small, polite smile, the kind I used to give at church gatherings or neighborhood dinners, and for a moment, no one spoke, not Jason, not Lily, not even Charles, and in that silence, I could feel the shift begin, subtle but unmistakable, like the first crack in ice before it breaks completely, because something about this didn't fit the story they had built in their minds, and Charles was the first one to sense it. I saw it in the way his posture changed, in the slight narrowing of his eyes as he leaned forward and glanced again at the final page, as if reading it differently now, as if searching for something he might have missed, and then he cleared his throat gently, the sound soft but enough to draw both Jason and Lily's attention, and he said, "Mrs. Harper, are you sure you understand what you've just signed?" And his tone was careful, professional, but there was something else beneath it, something closer to concern than procedure, and Jason let out a short laugh, a little too quick, a little too forced, waving his hand dismissively as if the question didn't need an answer. "She knows." "Charles, we've gone over this," he said, still not looking at me, and Lily nodded beside him, her smile tight, rehearsed, the kind that never quite reached her eyes, but I didn't look at either of them. I kept my gaze on Charles, steady and clear, and I tilted my head just slightly, the way I used to when Jason was a boy and I wanted him to tell me the truth about something he'd done, and I said, "Oh, I understand perfectly." And for the first time since we sat down, the room felt smaller, heavier, like the air itself had thickened, and Charles didn't respond right away. He just held my gaze for a second longer than was comfortable, and in that second, I knew he was beginning to see what they didn't, that this wasn't confusion, this wasn't weakness, this wasn't a woman giving up control because she had no other choice. And across from me, Lily shifted again, her fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the folder, a small, nervous movement she probably didn't even realize she was making, and Jason finally looked at me, really looked at me, as if trying to read something in my expression, something that would confirm his version of the story, but all he saw was calm. And calm can be a dangerous thing when people are expecting fear, because fear is predictable, fear can be managed, but calm leaves room for things they can't see yet. And I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my coat as I did, my movements deliberate, unhurried, the same way I had moved through every major moment of my life. From the day I bought that house with my husband to the day I buried him and came home to an empty kitchen that still smelled like his coffee, and I reached for my purse, lifting it from the back of the chair with steady hands, and for a brief moment, no one stopped me, no one said a word, because in their minds, This was the end, the moment everything shifted in their favor, the moment I became dependent, manageable, something to be handled rather than respected, and as I turned toward the door, I could feel their relief settling in behind me, quiet but unmistakable. And just before I reached the handle, Charles spoke again, softer this time, almost to himself. "That's unusual," and I paused, not turning around, just long enough for the silence to stretch 1 second further than it should have, and then I walked out without another word, leaving them in that room with their papers, their assumptions, and a truth they hadn't even begun to understand yet. I did not go home right away after I left that office, even though Jason assumed I would, even though Lily had already started planning in her head how they would help me pack by the end of the week, because I knew exactly what they would do next. I knew the rhythm of their thinking, the way they rushed toward what they believed was ownership, control, freedom, and I wanted to give them just enough time to step into it fully before anything shifted beneath their feet. So instead of driving back to the house on Maple Ridge, I turned left at the second light and headed toward a part of town I had not visited in years, a quiet street lined with old brick buildings and narrow sidewalks where people still walked slowly and minded their own business. And I parked in front of a small office with a brass plaque that most people would overlook unless they were looking for it, and for a moment I sat in the car with the engine off, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, listening to the silence that followed me everywhere these days, the kind of silence that used to feel empty but now felt useful, because silence gave you space to think, to plan, to remember, and I remembered everything, every conversation Jason thought I had forgotten, every glance Lily thought I had not noticed, every quiet shift in tone that told me I was no longer at the center of my own family, and when I stepped out of the car, I moved the same way I always had, steady, composed, not rushed, because rushing is what people do when they are afraid of what comes next, and I was not afraid, not anymore. And inside the office, the air smelled faintly of paper and old wood, and behind the front desk, a young assistant looked up with a polite smile that softened when she saw me, as if she recognized something in my face, something familiar, and she said, "Good afternoon, ma'am, how can I help you?" And I returned her smile with one of my own, the kind that made people feel at ease without giving anything away, and I said, "I have an appointment with Mr. Grant," and she nodded immediately, as if she had been expecting me, because she had. Because this had been arranged weeks ago, long before Jason and Lily ever brought those documents to the table, long before they thought they were the ones making decisions. And she led me down a narrow hallway to a door at the end, and when she opened it, he was already standing, already waiting, already aware of exactly why I was there, because he had been part of this from the beginning. "And Evelyn," he said, his voice calm, measured, the voice of a man who understood both the law and the people who tried to bend it. "Did everything go as expected?" And I set my purse down on the chair beside me before sitting across from him, smoothing the fabric of my coat with a small, automatic gesture, and I said, "Exactly as expected," and there was no need for more explanation than that, because he understood what those words meant. He understood that I had signed, that I had not resisted, that I had given them precisely what they asked for, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Because sometimes silence carries more information than words ever could, and then he nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he had already believed to be true, and he said, "Then it is only a matter of time now," and I looked at him, meeting his gaze directly, and I said, "How long?" And he considered the question carefully, not rushing to answer, because accuracy mattered more than reassurance in moments like this, and he said, "They will try to access the accounts first, then they will move toward the property. And when they realize the restrictions are active, they will contact their attorney, and that is when everything changes." And I let out a small breath, not a sigh, just a quiet release of air, because this was not about relief, this was about confirmation, about knowing that the structure I had put in place was already doing what it was designed to do. And I thought about Jason's face when he would first encounter that resistance, the confusion, the irritation, the way he would assume it was a mistake, because people like him always assume the system is on their side until it proves otherwise. And Lily would react differently. She would be quicker, sharper, more suspicious. She would look for someone to blame, someone to question, and eventually, her attention would turn back to me, but not yet, not until the first few doors closed in front of them without explanation, and Mr. Grant reached for a folder on his desk, sliding it toward me without opening it, because we both knew what was inside, the trust documents, the conditional clauses, the carefully constructed language that turned ownership into obligation, and he said, Once they trigger the first condition, the oversight transfers automatically, and I nodded, because I remembered every word of those documents, not just the legal terms, but the intent behind them, the purpose they served, and I said, and they cannot reverse it, and he shook his head once, firmly, not without your consent, and there was something steady, almost reassuring in the way he said it, not because it offered comfort, but because it confirmed control, and control was something I had learned to value differently over the years, not as something to hold over others, but as something to protect within yourself, and I stood up then, picking up my purse again, because there was nothing more to discuss, everything had already been set in motion, and as I turned toward the door, he said, Evelyn, and I paused, glancing back at him, and he added, they are not going to understand this right away, and I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that never quite reached my eyes, and I said, they were not supposed to, and then I walked out, back into the quiet hallway, past the assistant who looked up again with that same polite expression, and out onto the street where the afternoon light had shifted slightly, the shadows longer now, stretching across the pavement in ways that made everything look just a little different than it had an hour ago. And as I got back into my car, I did not feel anger, I did not feel sadness, I did not even feel satisfaction, because this was not about emotion anymore, this was about balance, about ensuring that what I had built could not be taken simply because someone believed they were entitled to it, and as I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, I knew that somewhere across town, Jason and Lily were already talking, already planning, already stepping into something they did not yet understand, and for the first time in a very long time, I let the silence sit with me without trying to fill it, because silence, when used correctly, does not mean absence, it means preparation. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun had already dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the front lawn, the same lawn Jason used to run across as a child with grass stains on his knees and laughter that filled the entire house, and for a brief moment I sat there again with the engine idling, looking at the windows of the place I had lived in for over 3 decades, the place he now believed was already his, and I wondered not whether I had done the right thing, but whether he would ever understand why it had to be done this way, and then I turned off the engine, stepped out, and walked up the path with the same steady pace I had kept all day, because nothing about my movements needed to change, not yet, and inside, the house was quiet in a way that felt almost staged, as if it were waiting for something to happen, and I set my purse down on the entry table, hanging my coat carefully on the hook beside the door, taking my time with each small action the way I always had, because routine has a way of grounding you when everything else begins to shift, and it was not long before I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway behind me, followed by the familiar click of the front door opening without a knock, because Jason had stopped knocking years ago, and Lily followed him in, her heels sharp against the hardwood floor, her voice already carrying a tone of excitement she was trying to keep controlled, and, Mom, we have been going over everything, Jason said as he stepped into the living room, his voice lighter than it had been in months, almost relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, and I turned toward him with a small smile, the same calm expression I had worn all afternoon, and I said, that was quick, and Lily let out a soft laugh, crossing her arms as she glanced around the room, already looking at the house differently, not as a place she visited, but as something she was evaluating, measuring, planning, and she said, we just wanted to make sure everything was in order, you know, to help things move smoothly, and I nodded slowly, as if that made perfect sense, because to them it did, because in their version of events, this was a transition, a natural next step, something practical and necessary, and Jason walked over to the kitchen counter, pulling out his phone as he spoke. We are going to start by consolidating the accounts, make things easier to manage, and then we can look at the property, maybe consider listing it by the end of the month, and his words came quickly now, one after another, as if saying them out loud made them more real, more certain, and I listened without interrupting, without correcting, without even reacting, because there was no need to stop them from stepping exactly where they intended to go, and Lily moved closer to the dining room, her fingers brushing lightly along the edge of the table, her eyes scanning the space with a kind of quiet calculation, and she added, it is just too much for one person, honestly, and we can find you something much more comfortable, something smaller, easier to maintain, and I watched her for a moment, the way she spoke about my life as if it were a piece of furniture to be rearranged, and I felt something settle inside me, not anger, not hurt, just clarity, the kind that comes when you finally see things exactly as they are, and I said, that sounds like a plan, and for a second, Both of them paused, as if they had expected at least a little resistance, a question, something to push against, but when none came, they relaxed into it even more, and Jason smiled, a genuine smile this time, the kind he had not shown me in years, and he said, "I knew you would understand." And that was the moment I realized how completely they had convinced themselves of this story, how deeply they believed that I was simply stepping aside, that I was handing over everything because I trusted them, because I needed them, because I had no other choice. And it is a strange thing, to watch someone you love build a reality that does not include you in it, but it is even stranger to know that you are the one who allowed them to do it, that you created the space for that belief to grow. And Lily moved back toward the living room, already pulling out her phone now. Scrolling through something as she spoke. "I have a few realtors in mind, people who specialize in properties like this. We can set up some consultations this week," and Jason nodded, already focused on his own screen. "And I will call the bank in the morning, get access sorted out, make sure everything is transferred properly." And I watched them both, standing there in the middle of the house that had once been the center of our family, speaking about it as if it were already gone, and I said nothing, because this was exactly how it needed to unfold, step by step, assumption by assumption, until the moment came when the ground beneath those assumptions shifted, and it did not take long. It never does when people move quickly without understanding the structure they are stepping into, because the next morning, just after 9 o'clock, my phone rang, and I looked at the screen long enough to see Jason's name before I answered, already knowing what I would hear in his voice before he said a single word. "And Mom," he began, his tone tight, controlled in a way that meant something had not gone as expected. "There is an issue with the accounts," and I leaned back slightly in my chair, holding the phone comfortably against my ear, and I said, "What kind of issue?" And there was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that happens when someone is trying to decide how much to say, how much to admit, and then he said, "They are saying there are restrictions, that we cannot access anything without additional authorization." And I let the silence stretch just a moment longer before I responded, not rushing, not pressing, just letting the weight of his words settle, and I said, "That is strange." And on the other end, I could hear Lily's voice in the background, sharper now, more urgent, asking questions, pushing for answers, and Jason covered the phone for a second before coming back, his voice lower, more tense. "Do you know anything about this?" And I looked out the window at the quiet street beyond, at the same sunlight that had been there yesterday, unchanged, steady, and I said, "No, I do not." And it was not a lie, not in the way they would understand it. Because what was happening now was not something new, not something unexpected, it was simply the system doing exactly what it had been designed to do, and as I ended the call, setting the phone down beside me, I knew this was only the beginning, the first small crack in the structure they believed they controlled, and somewhere across town, Jason and Lily were starting to realize that what they had been given was not what they thought it was, not at all. By the time Jason called again, it was just after noon, and this time he did not bother to soften his voice or pretend that everything was under control, because frustration has a way of stripping people down to what they really feel, and when I answered, there was no greeting, no polite lead-in, just a sharp exhale followed by, "Mom, something is not right," and I could hear Lily in the background again, louder now, her words no longer filtered, no longer careful, and I imagined her pacing back and forth in their kitchen, one hand gripping her phone while the other moved in quick, impatient gestures, and I remained seated at my dining table, the same place where I had spent so many mornings alone after my husband passed, my hands resting calmly on the wood surface as I listened, and I said, "You already mentioned there were restrictions," and Jason let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "It is more than that," he said, and there was a pause, the kind that comes when someone is trying to decide how much to admit, and then he added, "They are saying the accounts are not fully transferable, that there are conditions attached, and that we cannot make any changes without review." And I let those words settle between us, because words like conditions and review tend to sound harmless until you realize what they actually mean, and I said, "I am sure the bank can explain it." And for a moment there was silence on the line, and then Lily's voice cut through more clearly, sharper, more direct. "We already spoke to them," she said, not even trying to hide her irritation. "They told us to contact the attorney who prepared the documents," and I could almost see the look on her face, the tightness around her mouth, the way her eyes narrowed when something did not go according to plan, and Jason came back onto the line, his tone lower now, more controlled. "We are going to meet with Charles this afternoon," and I nodded slightly, even though he could not see me, because that was exactly where this needed to go next, exactly where it had always been leading, and I said, "That sounds reasonable," and he hesitated, just for a second, as if expecting more from me, an explanation, a concern, something to reassure him that this was all a misunderstanding. But when I offered nothing else, he said, "We will call you after," and the line went quiet, and I set the phone down slowly, my fingers lingering on it for a moment before I pulled my hand away, because this was the part where everything began to unfold on its own, without my involvement, without my presence, and that was important, because people only understand the truth when they discover it themselves, when no one is standing there guiding them toward it. And I stood up from the table, moving toward the kitchen with the same steady pace, filling a glass of water and taking a small sip as I looked out the window, and the world outside looked exactly the same as it had the day before, calm, ordinary, unchanged, and I thought about the first time I noticed things shifting between Jason and me, not all at once, not in a single moment, but gradually, in small ways that were easy to dismiss if you did not want to see them, the way he stopped asking my opinion before making decisions, the way Lily began answering questions that were directed at me, the way conversations would continue without including me even when I was sitting right there in the room, and at first I told myself it was normal, that this was just what happened when children grew up, when they built their own lives, but there is a difference between independence and exclusion, and it took me longer than it should have to recognize which one I was experiencing, and I remembered the night they first mentioned the house, how Lily had framed it as concern, as practicality. "It is just too much for one person," she had said, her voice soft, her expression sympathetic, and Jason had nodded beside her, not quite meeting my eyes, and I had looked around at the same walls, the same furniture, the same space that had held our entire family for decades, and I had said nothing, because I was still trying to understand what they were really asking, and over time, those suggestions became more direct, more specific, until they were no longer suggestions at all, but plans, decisions made without me and presented as if they were already agreed upon, and that was when I realized something important, something that changed the way I looked at everything that followed. They were not trying to take care of me, they were trying to take control, and there is a difference between those two things that becomes very clear once you see it, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and that is when I made the first call, not to the bank, not to anyone they would expect, but to someone who understood how to protect what needed to be protected without making it obvious, and that was how all of this began, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with preparation, quiet, careful preparation that unfolded over weeks while they believed nothing had changed, and now, standing in my kitchen with the afternoon light shifting across the floor, I knew that preparation was about to reveal itself in ways they had not anticipated, and somewhere across town, Jason and Lily were sitting across from Charles Bennett again, but this time the conversation would not be about transferring ownership or simplifying assets, it would be about limitations, about structures, about conditions that existed long before they ever signed a single document, and Charles, who had already sensed something was off the moment I signed without hesitation, would be the one to explain it to them, not because I told him to, but because it was his job to interpret what was written in front of him, and sometimes the truth does not need to be delivered by the person who created it, sometimes it is more powerful when it comes from someone else entirely, and I returned to the table, sitting down again with the same calm posture, the same steady hands, because nothing about me needed to change for this to work, and as the minutes passed, I did not check the time, I did not wait by the phone, I simply let the day move forward at its own pace, because I knew that when the next call came, it would not be about confusion anymore, it would be about realization, and realization is where everything truly begins. The call came just before 5 in the afternoon, right at that quiet hour when the day begins to settle but the evening has not fully arrived, and I knew the moment I saw Jason's name on the screen that something had shifted, not just in the situation, but in him, because there is a difference between confusion and realization, and you can hear it in a person's voice before they ever explain it, and when I answered, he did not speak immediately, there was a pause, longer than before, heavier. And in that pause I could almost feel the weight of everything Charles must have just told them settling into place, and then he said, "Mom, what did you do?" And his voice was not angry, not yet, it was something else, something closer to disbelief, the kind that comes when the story you believed begins to unravel in front of you, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the question sit between us for a moment, because sometimes people need to hear their own words echo before they are ready to understand the answer, and I said, "I signed the documents you asked me to sign," and there was a sharp breath on the other end, followed by Lily's voice again, no longer controlled, no longer measured. That is not what this is, she said, her words quick, edged with frustration. Charles says the assets are locked inside a trust structure, that everything is conditional, that we do not actually have control over anything. And I could picture Charles sitting across from them, calm, precise, explaining each clause the way it was written, not adding anything, not softening it, just stating facts. And facts have a way of sounding very different when they do not support what you expected. And Jason came back onto the line, his voice tighter now. He said there are behavioral conditions, oversight provisions, limitations on liquidation, that even the house cannot be sold without triggering a review process. And I let those words settle, because they were not new to me. They were exactly what I had put in place, and I said, then he explained it correctly, and there was silence again. But this time it was not confusion, it was tension, the kind that builds when someone begins to realize they are not in control of the situation they thought they owned. And Jason's voice dropped lower, more direct. Why would you do this? And that question hung in the air, heavier than anything else he had said so far, because it was not really about the documents. It was about intention, about motive, about understanding why things had been set up this way. And I looked down at my hands resting on the table, the same hands that had signed those papers without hesitation. And I thought about all the moments that had led here, the quiet conversations, the subtle shifts, the gradual way I had been moved from the center of decisions to the edge of them. And I said, because you asked me to give you everything. And before he could respond, Lily cut in again, sharper now. That is not everything, Evelyn. That is a trap. And there it was, the word she chose without thinking, the word that revealed exactly how she saw this situation, not as a misunderstanding, not as a complication, but as something intentional, something designed. And I allowed myself a small pause before I answered, keeping my voice steady, calm, the same tone I had used all along, and I said, it is a structure. And on the other end, I could hear movement, chairs shifting, the faint sound of papers being handled, and Jason said, we cannot access the funds without approval. We cannot make decisions without oversight. It says everything has to be reviewed based on certain conditions. What conditions? And I knew exactly which clause he was referring to. The one that tied authority to responsibility, the one that required them to demonstrate stability, cooperation, and mutual agreement before any control could be exercised. And I said, the conditions are outlined in the documents. And Lily let out a short, frustrated laugh. Do not do that. Do not pretend this is normal. This is not how inheritance works. And I could hear the edge in her voice now, the frustration turning into something closer to anger. And I said, it is not an inheritance. And that was the first time I corrected them directly, not loudly, not forcefully, just a simple statement. And it landed exactly where it needed to, because there was a pause after that, a longer one, and Jason spoke again, slower this time, as if choosing his words more carefully. Then what is it? And I looked out the window again, at the same quiet street, the same steady light that had not changed all day, and I said, it is a responsibility. And those words settled differently, heavier, because responsibility is not something you take, it is something you carry. And I could almost feel the shift on the other end of the line, the moment when they began to understand that what they had been given was not freedom, not ownership, but something far more complex, something that required more than just access and control. And Lily spoke again. But her tone had changed, less sharp, more calculating. And who decides if those conditions are met? And I knew she was already thinking ahead, already trying to find a way around what had been put in place. And I said, the system does. And that answer frustrated her more than anything else. Because systems are not people. They cannot be persuaded. They cannot be rushed. They do exactly what they are designed to do. And Jason let out a slow breath. And when he spoke again, there was something different in his voice, something quieter, something closer to realization. So we cannot do anything without going through this process. And I said, that is correct. And the silence that followed was not empty this time. It was full of everything they were beginning to understand, everything they had not expected. And finally, Jason said, we need to talk about this in person. And I nodded, even though he could not see me. And I said, of course. And when the call ended, I set the phone down gently on the table, my hand resting on it for a moment before I pulled it away. Because this was the moment where everything shifted from assumption to understanding, from expectation to reality. And somewhere across town, Jason and Lily were sitting in that office with Charles, looking at documents that no longer meant what they thought they did. And for the first time since this began, they were starting to see not just what they had been given, but what it required of them. and that was the part they had never considered. They arrived earlier than I expected the next morning, not with the usual ease of stepping into the house like it already belonged to them, but with a kind of tension that followed them through the door, something tighter, more controlled, as if every movement now carried a question behind it, and I was already in the kitchen when I heard the handle turn, already pouring coffee into a cup I did not need but appreciated for the warmth it gave my hands, and when Jason walked in, he did not speak right away. He just stood there for a second longer than usual, looking at me in a way he had not in years, not as someone to be managed or guided, but as someone he needed something from, and Lily stepped in behind him, her posture straight, her expression composed but sharper now, the confidence she had carried the day before replaced with something more cautious, more deliberate, and I turned toward them with the same calm expression I had kept from the beginning, and I said, "You are early," and Jason gave a small nod, running a hand through his hair in a gesture I remembered from when he was younger, when things did not go the way he expected, and he said, "We needed to talk," and I gestured lightly toward the table, "Then sit," and they did, though not as comfortably as before, not leaning back, not relaxed, but sitting forward, attentive, as if this conversation required more from them than they had anticipated, and for a moment no one spoke, the silence settling in a way that felt different now, no longer empty but weighted, and Jason finally broke it. "Charles explained everything," he said, his voice steady but measured, and I nodded once, taking a small sip of my coffee before setting the cup down carefully. "Then you understand," and Lily let out a quiet breath, her fingers interlacing on the table in front of her. "We understand that we do not have control," she said, choosing her words precisely, "not the way we were told," and I watched her as she spoke, noting the shift in how she framed things, no longer assuming, now clarifying. And I said, "You have access, under conditions," and Jason leaned forward slightly, his eyes focused now, more present than they had been in a long time. "What conditions?" And I met his gaze, holding it just long enough for the moment to settle, and I said, "The ones that ensure the decisions being made are responsible," and he frowned slightly, not in anger, but in concentration, trying to understand the boundaries he was now facing, and Lily spoke again, quicker this time. "That is not specific," she said, and there was a hint of frustration returning to her voice, though more controlled than before, and I said, "It is meant to be applied, not memorized," and that answer did not satisfy her. I could see it in the way her posture shifted, in the way she leaned back slightly as if reassessing the situation from a different angle, and Jason asked, "Who decides what is responsible?" And I did not hesitate, "The structure does," and he let out a slow breath, leaning back now as well, his shoulders lowering just slightly as the weight of that answer settled in, because a structure does not argue, it does not negotiate, it simply exists and enforces what it was designed to enforce, and for a moment, no one spoke, and I let that silence remain, because silence is where understanding begins to form, not in the noise of questions, but in the space where answers start to make sense. And finally, Lily said, "So we cannot sell the house," and it was not a question, it was a realization, and I nodded, "Not without review," and Jason added, "And we cannot move the funds," and I said, "Not without meeting the conditions," and he looked down at his hands for a moment, as if tracing the outline of something that was no longer there, and then he looked back up. "Why did you not tell us?" And that question was different from the one he had asked the day before. It was not about what I had done, but about why I had not explained it, and I considered it carefully before answering, because the answer mattered, not just for him, but for what came next, and I said, "Because you were not asking to understand, you were asking to take over," and that landed quietly, without force, but with weight, and I saw it in the way his expression changed, in the slight tightening of his jaw, not in anger, but in recognition, and Lily shifted again, her voice softer now, more measured. "We were trying to help," she said, and I looked at her, not with judgment, not with accusation, but with the same calm clarity I had carried through all of this, and I said, "Helping does not remove someone from their own life," and she did not respond immediately, and that was telling, because people respond quickly when they believe they are right, but they pause when something challenges that belief, and Jason leaned forward again, his voice quieter now. "So what happens now?" And I folded my hands together on the table, the same way I had in that office the day before, and I said, "Now, you learn how to work within what you have been given," and he held my gaze for a moment longer, searching for something, maybe a way around it, maybe a sign that this could be undone, but there was none, because this was not something that could be argued away, it was already in place, already functioning, and Lily asked, "And if we do not?" and I met her eyes this time, steady, calm, and I said, "Then nothing changes," and that was the truth of it, simple, direct, and impossible to ignore, and the room fell quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, not tense, not uncertain, but settled, as if the shape of the situation had finally become clear, and for the first time since this began, they were not reacting, they were thinking, and that was where everything would begin to shift, not because of what I had done, but because of what they were starting to understand. The shift did not happen all at once, it never does. It began in small ways, almost invisible at first, the kind of changes you would miss if you were not paying attention, but I had learned to pay attention, and over the next few days, I watched Jason and Lily move through the house differently, not with the quiet confidence they had carried before, but with a kind of measured caution, as if every step now required thought, as if the space itself no longer responded to them the way they expected, and it started with the calls, not to me, but to the bank, to Charles, to anyone who might offer a different answer, a different interpretation, something that would restore what they believed they had lost, and each time, the result was the same careful explanations, the same firm limitations, the same quiet reinforcement that what had been set in place could not simply be bypassed, and I did not need to hear those conversations to know how they went. I could see it in the way Jason would come home later than usual, his movements slower, more deliberate, his phone still in his hand as if he were expecting it to ring again with a solution that never came, and Lily, who once moved through the house with a kind of effortless certainty, now paused more often, standing in doorways, looking at things not as possessions, but as questions. And one evening, as I sat in the living room with a book open in my lap, not reading but simply holding it, I heard them in the kitchen, their voices low but not low enough to hide the tension beneath them, and, "There has to be a way around it," Lily said, her tone tight, controlled, and Jason responded more quietly, "Charles said the conditions are embedded, that everything is tied together, the accounts, the property, even the decision rights," and there was a pause, followed by the sound of something being set down on the counter a little harder than necessary, and Lily said, "Then we change the conditions," and I could not see her, but I could picture the way she said it, the certainty, the assumption that systems could be adjusted the same way people could, and Jason let out a breath, longer this time, heavier. "It does not work like that," he said, and that was the first time I heard it in his voice. Not frustration, not resistance, but acceptance, the beginning of it at least, and I sat there, still, quiet, letting their conversation unfold without interruption, because this was not something I needed to be part of, this was something they needed to move through on their own, and over the next few days, that pattern continued, attempts followed by explanations, questions followed by the same answers, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, their focus began to shift, not away from the structure, but toward understanding it, and that is when the real change began, not when they realized they could not control it, but when they started to see what it required. And one morning, Jason came into the kitchen while I was making coffee, his movements quieter now, more thoughtful, and he said, "I spoke with Charles again," and I nodded, not looking up immediately, finishing the simple task in front of me before turning toward him, because even small actions matter in moments like this, and I said, and he hesitated, just slightly, before continuing. He said the conditions are not meant to block us, they are meant to guide decisions, and I met his gaze, seeing the difference there now, the shift from frustration to consideration, and I said, "That is correct," and he leaned against the counter, not fully relaxed, but no longer tense. He also said the oversight is not permanent, that it adjusts based on how decisions are made over time, and I nodded again, because that too was part of the structure, the part that allowed for growth, for change, for responsibility to be demonstrated rather than assumed, and he looked down for a moment, then back at me, "Why did you not just explain that?" And I considered the question, not because I did not have an answer, but because I wanted him to hear it clearly, and I said, "Because you would have tried to work around it instead of understanding it," and he did not argue, he did not push back, he just stood there, letting that settle, and that was new, that was different, and Lily joined us a few minutes later, her expression still guarded, still careful, but less sharp than before, and she said, "If we follow the conditions, if we make decisions the way the structure requires, then access changes," and it was not a question, it was a statement, one she had already confirmed, and I said, "Yes," and she held my gaze for a moment, searching for something, perhaps a sign that this was temporary, that there was still a shortcut, but there was none, and she looked away first, her attention shifting to the window, to something beyond it, as if recalibrating, and for the first time since this began, the conversation was not about what they could not do, but about what they could, and that was the turning point, not dramatic, not loud, but steady, the kind of shift that changes everything without announcing itself. And as the morning light moved across the kitchen, I realized that what I had given them was not control, not in the way they expected, but something far more difficult, something that required patience, awareness, and accountability, and whether they accepted that or not was no longer something I needed to manage, because the structure would do that on its own, exactly as it was designed to do. It was not the arguments that changed first, but the way they stopped having them, because before, everything between Jason and Lily had been fast, reactive, driven by urgency and assumption, but now there were pauses, longer ones, moments where neither of them spoke right away because they were thinking, calculating, reconsidering, and I began to notice it in the smallest interactions. The way Jason would stop mid-sentence and correct himself, the way Lily would ask a question instead of making a statement, and one evening, as we sat around the dining table, the same table where they had once planned to divide everything as if it were already theirs, Jason placed a folder down carefully in front of him, not with the confidence he had shown before, but with a kind of deliberate control, and he said, "We reviewed the conditions again," and I nodded slightly, setting my fork down beside my plate, because I knew this conversation was different before he even continued, and Lily added, "Not just with Charles, we went through everything ourselves," and there was something in her tone now that had not been there before, not just frustration or resistance, but effort, the kind that comes when someone is trying to understand something instead of bypass it. And Jason opened the folder, not to show me, but to organize his thoughts, and he said, "The structure is not blocking access, it is evaluating decisions." And I said nothing, letting him continue, because this needed to come from him, not from me, and he went on, "If we make financial decisions that meet the criteria, the restrictions adjust. If we try to bypass them, they tighten." And he looked up at me then, not for confirmation, but for acknowledgement, and I gave a small nod, because he was beginning to see it clearly now, not as an obstacle, but as a system. And Lily leaned forward slightly, her hands resting flat on the table, and she said, "It is not just about money, it is about behavior, consistency, cooperation," and that word, cooperation, lingered in the air for a moment, because it was the one they had struggled with the most. Not with each other, but with me, and I said, "Yes," and the conversation did not escalate after that. It did not turn into questions or challenges, it settled into something quieter, more reflective, and that was the real shift, not in what they said, but in how they approached it. And over the next few days, that shift became more visible, not in big gestures, but in small, consistent changes. Jason began including me in conversations again, not out of obligation, but because he needed my perspective, and Lily, who had once redirected decisions away from me, now paused to ask, "What do you think?" before moving forward, and it was subtle, almost easy to miss, but it was there. And one afternoon, Jason came into the living room where I was sitting, his phone in his hand, but not looking at it, and he said, "We were reviewing the property options again," and I looked up from the book I was holding, marking my place before setting it aside, and I said, and he hesitated for just a moment, then said, "We are not listing the house," and I studied his face for a second, not because I was surprised, but because I wanted to see how he arrived at that decision, and he added, "It does not meet the conditions right now, and even if it did, it would not make sense," and I nodded once, because that was exactly the kind of reasoning the structure was designed to encourage, not reaction, not impulse, but consideration. And Lily joined us shortly after, her tone measured, her posture less rigid than before, and she said, "We are also adjusting how we handle the accounts, smaller decisions, more transparency," and I could hear it in her voice now, not resistance, but adaptation, the kind that comes when someone realizes that fighting the system is less effective than working within it. And I said, "That is how it is meant to function," and she held my gaze for a moment, not with challenge, but with something closer to acceptance, and then she nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something she had not wanted to admit before. And as the days passed, the tension that had once filled the house began to ease, not completely, not all at once, but gradually, replaced by something more stable, more grounded, and I found myself moving through the same spaces with a different awareness, not because the house had changed, but because the dynamics within it had. And one evening, as I stood by the window watching the light fade from the sky, Jason came to stand beside me, not speaking right away, just sharing the silence, and after a moment, he said, I thought this was about control, and I turned slightly toward him, waiting, and he continued, but it is not. It is about responsibility, and I studied his expression, the way he said the word responsibility, not as a burden, but as something he was beginning to understand, and I said, control without responsibility does not last, and he nodded slowly, letting that settle, and for the first time since all of this began, there was no tension in that moment, no resistance, just a quiet understanding, and as he walked away, I remained by the window a little longer, watching the last of the light disappear, knowing that what had changed was not the structure, not the documents, not the conditions, but the way they were finally beginning to see them, and that was the part that mattered most, because systems can guide behavior, but understanding is what sustains it. The following morning did not feel different on the surface. The same light came through the kitchen window, the same quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the space, the same coffee brewed slowly on the counter, but something beneath all of that had settled into a new shape, not tense, not uncertain, but steady, and I noticed it in the way Jason entered the room, not rushing, not distracted, but present, the way he paused before speaking, as if considering not just what he was about to say, but how it would fit into everything else that now mattered, and he said, I went through the reports again, and I nodded slightly, setting my cup down, because I knew this was not just an update, it was a reflection, and he continued, the structure tracks patterns, not just decisions, it looks at consistency over time, and I watched him as he spoke, the way he was no longer reacting to the system, but studying it, learning from it, and I said, yes, and he added, it is not about passing a test, it is about how you operate every day. And that was the moment I knew he had truly begun to understand, not just the mechanics, but the purpose, and Lily joined us a few minutes later, her movements quieter now, more measured, and she said, we adjusted the account usage, smaller approvals, documented decisions, shared access, and there was no frustration in her voice this time, no resistance, just a clear statement of what they were doing differently. And I said, and what did you notice? And she hesitated for a brief moment before answering, not because she did not know, but because she was choosing her words carefully. It responds, she said, not immediately, but it responds, and I nodded, because that was exactly how it was designed, not to react to single actions, but to patterns, to consistency, to intention demonstrated over time, and Jason leaned against the counter, his arms folded loosely, not defensive, but thoughtful, and he said, we thought it was limiting us, but it was actually showing us what we were doing wrong, and I did not respond right away. I let that statement sit in the air, because sometimes people need to hear their own realization without interruption, and after a moment, I said, it was showing you what needed to change, and he nodded slowly, accepting that distinction, and for a moment, the three of us stood there in the same space that had once felt divided, now quieter, more aligned, and Lily looked at me, not with challenge, not with calculation, but with something closer to acknowledgement, and she said, you knew we would try to take control, and I met her gaze steadily, not avoiding it, not softening it, and I said, I knew you would move too quickly, and that was the truth of it, not an accusation, not a judgment, just an observation, and she held my gaze for a second longer before looking away, not in defeat, but in recognition, and Jason asked, and this was the only way to stop that? And I considered the question carefully, because the answer mattered, not just for what had happened, but for what came next, and I said, this was the way to make sure it did not continue, and he nodded again, more firmly this time, as if something had settled into place inside him, and later that afternoon, as I sat in the living room, the same book in my hands, though I was actually reading this time, I heard Jason on the phone in the other room, his voice calm, steady, explaining something to someone, and I caught a few words as he passed by, yes, we are following the conditions, and, no, it is structured that way for a reason, and there was no frustration in his tone, no attempt to push back, just a clear understanding of what needed to be done, and that was when I realized that the system had done exactly what it was meant to do, not just limit, not just protect, but teach, and teaching is something that cannot be forced, it has to be experienced, understood, lived through, and as the day moved into evening, the house felt different again, not because anything physical had changed, but because the way we moved within it had. And at dinner, the conversation was not about plans to sell or transfer or control, it was about decisions, considerations, possibilities that were grounded in something more stable. And as I listened, I did not need to guide, I did not need to correct, because they were already adjusting, already thinking differently, and after the dishes were cleared and the house grew quiet again, Jason stood by the doorway for a moment before speaking, and he said, "I thought you gave us everything," and I looked up at him, meeting his gaze with the same calm expression I had carried from the beginning, and I said, "I did," and he held that for a second, considering it, and then he nodded, slowly, as if finally understanding what that meant. Not everything they wanted, but everything they needed, and as he walked away, I remained where I was, the room quiet around me, the same walls, the same furniture, the same space that had held so much change over such a short time, and I realized that nothing had been taken from them, nothing had been withheld, they had been given exactly what they asked for, just not in the way they expected, and sometimes that is the only way people learn what something is truly worth.